Now, I have to warn you before we begin that there's going to be some spoilers for the latest episode of The Bad Batch in this video, which at the time of recording this is the 12th episode of Season 1 called Rescue on Ryloth. So if you haven't seen it yet and you don't want it ruined, by all means click away and come back after you have seen it. Okay, so something I've seen a lot of people discussing lately, and I've been talking about it quite a bit myself in my reviews for The Bad Batch, is the inhibitor chips in the heads of the clones. In fact, I was going to bring it up in my most recent review, until I realized I'd spend way too much time talking about it and figured a separate video just might be the place for it, and so here we are. Anyway, there's been a lot of confusion, and rightfully so, about just how the chips work, so let's review the evidence, discuss it, speculate, and do all that kind of fun stuff. And by all means, do take to the comments below and give me your thoughts and agree or disagree with me about how I think they work. Okay, so first of all, there are some people who will say this is something we shouldn't overthink. Exactly how they work isn't that big of a deal. And I might just agree with you, I just might be willing to let some things slide with them if they weren't attached to, and you could say responsible for, one of the most famous or infamous moments in all of Star Wars, that being Order 66, the extermination of the Jedi by the clones. And sure, maybe back when there was just the prequels or before the animated Clone Wars series started in 2008, I don't think too many people or fans gave too much thought as to how Order 66 went down exactly, or why the clones followed the order without a second thought, as seen in that little montage in Revenge of the Sith. After all, we'd heard in episode 2 that they follow any and all orders without question, and while we hadn't really seen much of anything from them in the meantime, or in the films themselves to contradict that. So I think we just assumed that they were following an order from the Supreme Chancellor of the Republic without question, and that's not a perfect explanation, but I think it worked at the time. However, the Clone Wars animated series blows that simple and generic explanation right out of the water. It makes no sense that, say, Commander Cody would, again without hesitation or a second thought, give the order to fire at Obi-Wan, who he'd been friends with for years at that point, and that all the other clones of the 212th would carry out that order without question either, that they wouldn't look around at each other and be like, is Cody serious right now? We're supposed to shoot Obi-Wan? And just imagine for a moment if we take the prequels out of the equation, or let's say you're someone who just watched the Clone Wars animated series, and let's also say you take out anything and everything we learn about the chips in their heads during Season 6, let's just erase that, and you get to Season 7 and suddenly Rex and the other clones hear Palpatine say, execute Order 66, and without hesitation they open fire on Ahsoka, while still wearing the helmets they painted to honor her, and Rex in this case wouldn't hesitate to fire either, presumably anyway, because he wouldn't know everything that happened with Fives in Season 6. And if all this happened this way, I think most people would scream at their TV, what the blank is going on right now? This is the worst, dumbest thing I've ever seen in my life. There is no way they would fire on her. None, zero, zip. And so if I had to guess, I'd say the chips in the heads of the clones are a sort of retroactive decision on the part of George Lucas, meaning that at some point during the making of the Clone Wars, after the show was building these great bonds or relationships between the Jedi and the clones who served under them, he thought to himself, that scene as is in Revenge of the Sith doesn't make a whole lot of sense anymore. I've shown that the clones have a great deal of independence and have come to really learn to think for themselves and be their own individuals, so there's no way that even most of them would follow Order 66, much less virtually all of them, and thus in Season 6 of Clone Wars, we get Fives and the inhibitor chip arc. And sure, maybe all along Lucas had intended for there to be chips in the heads of the clones that made them carry out Order 66, who knows. Either way, it leads to all sorts of interesting questions about how exactly do the chips work, and how long does the effect last, and so on. And one of the best clues or pieces of evidence we have to get some answers comes to us from Wrecker, who, after having his chip taken out, said to Omega of his experience while it was still in his head and activated that, I tried to control it, I tried as hard as I could, I just couldn't make it stop. In other words, Wrecker was not only still in there, but was consciously aware of what he was doing. He knew it was something he didn't want to do, but couldn't stop himself. This falls in line with what the couple other clones we know who had their chips first activated and then removed have also said, like Rex, who was still very much the same old Rex as soon as the chip was removed. However, Rex was also able to sort of momentarily resist Order 66. He didn't immediately fire on Ahsoka, but instead told her to find Fives, who he knew would lead her to the answers. Meaning, in the back of his head somewhere, as all this was happening, he knew what was happening to him, and apparently was able to resist just momentarily, Wrecker, on the other hand, also knew about the chips, more so than even Rex did actually, but was completely unable to resist, which I guess we could chalk up to Wrecker not being the brightest clone in the bunch. Anyway, all this means that the clones do not have their memories wiped or erased, and they're not technically brainwashed. They're the same person they've always been inside their heads. They've just become good soldiers who follow orders, as they basically say, and I think is the biggest clue as to what exactly has happened to them. Because they seem to just now follow orders above all else, above allowing themselves to carry out these independent thoughts that they have, even though they still do have the thoughts, or are again still who they've always been, trapped in their own head. In other words, what I think the chips do is sort of suppress free will, but not exactly free thinking, however that would work. And it takes the whole thing we heard in episode 2 about them following any order without question to the absolute extreme, to the point it becomes all they're actually capable of doing. Well, that and anything a good soldier would do besides that, like keeping themselves healthy and alive. It's not like they need to be told everything they're supposed to do. In fact, I think there is simply a list of things or priorities that they follow now. That's what Order 66 actually is. It, yes, is also a keyword or phrase, I should say, that triggers the chips, but it's also a list of orders that they have somehow been programmed with, kind of like droids, or that they otherwise know somehow that they default to when they hear those magical words. It turns off choice and replaces it with just a list of priorities that good soldiers must follow, hence they keep saying that. And at the top of the list, or the number one priority, is to kill any and all Jedi on sight without hesitation. This, you could say, is their primary objective, followed closely, it seems, to killing any treasonous clones who are not following Order 66. And then down from there are probably such mundane things or orders as taking care of yourself or keeping your weapons and armor in good condition. Again, it covers the basics and only the basics, so they don't need to be micromanaged all the time, but they also don't do anything they used to do or anything they want to do. Anyway then, the fact that taking out treasonous clones seems to be a specific order could imply that they, and by they I mean Palpatine and the Kaminoans behind all this, knew or feared some clones would resist the effects of the chips, or that maybe some might be damaged over the course of the war, should a clone maybe suffer a head injury, sort of like what we saw with Wrecker, only in reverse, that instead of activating like it did in his case, it would never activate. Either way, it does seem like it's something that a specific sort of order within Order 66 was designed for, or that they planned for, that they were ready and feared some clones might not comply, or that it just wouldn't work on them. Rex even says not all clones were affected by it, and he was talking about some beyond members of the Bad Batch who are enhanced clones or Echo, who had gone through so much trauma. He was talking about just other random clones out there who had not followed Order 66. Another interesting question to ask then is there a way to easily deactivate the chips once they've been activated by the phrase, execute Order 66? Or maybe I should ask if there is another phrase, a counterphrase that shuts them off, which you almost think there would be in case it accidentally went off in a clone or multiple clones, if many of them somehow heard the activation words before it was the right time, which seems unlikely but not impossible. However, when the chip went off early in Tup back in Season 6 of Clone Wars and he even killed a Jedi, the Kaminoans didn't use any sort of phrase to shut him off, though they also were interested in what had gone wrong with the chip and weren't too concerned about the fate of Tup. They weren't trying to save him or anything, just investigate. So maybe a phrase to shut them off does exist, who knows either way. What we do know after the most recent episode of The Bad Batch is that some clones didn't seem to be all too affected by the chip when Order 66 was given, which we already did know was going to be the case for a rare few, I think we assumed, again going off what Rex had said a few episodes earlier. However, again, in the most recent episode, we saw several clones apparently capable of free will when they lay down their arms after Captain Hauser gives them a little speech about what they are becoming, which doesn't seem like it makes sense or lines up with what we know or think we know about the chips. And so I think there are a couple possibilities here, the only one that really makes sense, which is that these clones never received Order 66 for one reason or another, and no one realized that they hadn't. And I mean, it's not like everyone knew after the fact what had happened with the clones and the chips, that something made them turn on the Jedi. I actually think that would forever remain a closely guarded secret that only the likes of Palpatine, Tarkin, and maybe a few others within the Empire might ever really know what happened. Heck, I don't think Vader would even be told, considering his former attachment to the clones. Now, how or why this could be the case, that they didn't get the order considering it was like on every channel and, as far as we know, was broadcast to every clone in every corner of the galaxy, is unknown, but that doesn't mean it didn't happen that way. Perhaps it was simply some sort of interference around the planet Ryloth that day and it never reached them. And then when you consider, as far as we know, neither Captain Hauser nor any of the troopers under his command have ever served with the Jedi, they might not find it too strange that their brothers across the galaxy had turned on and killed the Jedi. They wouldn't know the bond that had formed between them all. And I think it's pretty clear that Hauser has become the way he is because of the Syndulla family, that they made him like many of his brothers who did serve under the Jedi, that they are the ones who turned him into a good person and someone who would question what the Empire was doing, as we see him doing multiple times in these episodes. Another possibility here is that in time, the clones start to overcome the programming and regain control, though the problem with that is they would know they were being controlled. Again, they are consciously aware of the fact that they are being compelled to do these things, so when it started to wear off, you would think they would rebel. You'd think they'd be pretty mad, and maybe they will rebel. Maybe what happened on Ryloth was the first such incident, or just the beginning of something much, much bigger for the clones. And I do think that's going to be the case. I think what happened on Ryloth is going to be the final straw, and the Empire will now completely shut down the clone program and go stormtroopers, which we know is ultimately going to happen one way or another. The only question left is, how do the clones respond? Especially if the chips are starting to wear off. Do they go quietly in the night, or will there be some type of uprising? Well, that's all I've got for you this time. Now it's your turn to tell me what you think about the inhibitor chips and how they work. And why did Hauser and his men seem to be unaffected by them, especially Hauser? Whatever you think, leave a comment below and let's talk some Star Wars. And until next time, thanks for watching.